Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Again, I won't take up too much of your time, other than to introduce to you Mr. David Glover.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here again, and thank you to the staff here at Halifax House for inviting me to come back and talk about some connections of Emily Brontë with Calderdale. Some of you will probably know that back in March, 2 young Australians from Queensland arrived in England. They're going to do some filming. One of them was called Margot Robbie, the other was called Jacob Elordi. And they stayed here very unexpectedly, and I believe no pictures exist to prove it, but I'm happy to say I believe those who saw them. So this is a nice connection that we have of recent times, because they're going to film, no, they've been filming, they're going to produce a film which is coming out in February, which is the latest version, is it number 137 or something, of Wuthering Heights. So we don't know what to look forward to. All I would say, it sounds a bit more raunchy than some of the earlier ones. Not quite the earlier ideas of off we go. So thank you everybody for coming. I hope you've enjoyed your food. Thank you to Chris and thank you to Liz who booked me, and all of you. Off we go. So here we are with a view of a lovely old house. Courtesy of a very kind gentleman who is very, very talented. Some of you would have noticed that over to my left, over that way, is a model of a house called High Sunderland. It's a scale model built out of stone. It took about 2.5 years to make, and in the interval I hope you'll have the opportunity to go across and look at it. I'm hugely privileged that Peter Whiteley's daughter Rachel, who I know through the museum service, was telling me about this when she heard about this talk, and I said, well, is there any chance we might borrow it for tonight? And she was very, very kind. She asked her dad, she pulled out all the stops, and if you try it, you'll see it's got electric lighting. I'm not sure they had that in Emily Brontë's day. Also, it will rotate. If it rotates, they'll be very careful. There are certain aspects of the building which you can only see from different sides, and you'll hear a little bit about this building as we go through my talk. But there are other aspects as well, but it's a lovely bit of icing on the cake is that model over there, and I'm sure you'll enjoy looking at it later. So off we go then. Emily Brontë, Law Hill, Wuthering Heights, High Sunderland. Where were all these places? Were some of them real? Were some of them represented by buildings in Calderdale? We're going to see. So when I was about 13, growing up in the London suburbs, my mother took me up to London to the National Portrait Gallery, and I love portraits. I didn't know much about art in those days, and I saw this curious image, which you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure, if you love the Brontes, and it's the three sisters as painted by Branwell, and he painted himself out later. And this was so unusual in portraits of famous people, generals, kings, queens, and everybody, politicians. And it just captured my imagination that it was different. So I heard a bit about the Brontes then from my mother, who'd come to stay in Yorkshire before she was married, and who'd been to the Haworth parsonage and learned a bit about the Brontes. So, and then a bit later for my English Lit O-level, I was giving Wuthering Heights to read, study, and analyse. This was not particularly easy for me. I had a very repressed upbringing, and to read about Cathy and all her passions, and these people running about on the moors. I did know Yorkshire already a bit, but I was in suburban London, and it was a bit challenging. Well, I got there, and I'm here today. I'm not saying there's any link between the two. So tonight, then, a bit of detail about Emily Brontë, who was, of course, the authoress of Wuthering Heights and Calderdale. And we're going to have a look at the possibility that a wonderful old stone house, which stood high above the Godley Cutting near Halifax, was represented in Wuthering Heights as that building. And here we see the front of High Sunderland Hall, as it is sometimes called, high up on the edge of the moors. Also, this evening, you will hear a little bit, I think it's in the second half, about a man who lived not too far away from where Emily was teaching and built the house at Law Hill. Some would say that he was one of the inspirations, or the inspiration, for Heathcliff. So off we go. Here's the syllabus. A very brief life of Emily Brontë. Emily Bronte's godfather at his Halifax and Calderdale links. Emily at Law Hill, 1838-9. High Sunderland, local inspiration for the house at Wuthering Heights. A brief history of High Sunderland. Then a Southowram inspiration for Heathcliff and the story of Jack Sharp. And finally, Miss Patchett gets married. Those of you who know who Miss Patchett was will be aware. The others will have to wait till the second half. So off we go then. Many of you will know, I guess, more than I do about Emily Bronte's life. Perhaps some of you will know it off by heart. I have read a bit about it, I have books about her and so on. You probably remember that she was one of the daughters of the Reverend Patrick Brontë at the time when she was born to her father and mother. Her mother was, of course, from Cornwall originally. She was Maria Branwell. They had been married in Yorkshire, though, at Guiseley Parish Church in 1812. So that's what they looked like when they were somewhat younger. These are the only early images we have of them. In fact, I think that's the only proven image we have of Maria. So the Brontë children, the younger Brontë children anyway, were born at Thornton, this side of Bradford, not too many miles from where we are tonight, in what was then called the parsonage, just almost like a terraced house in the main street in Thornton, where Patrick was then the curate at the church, which was an old chapel across the main road, which has since been demolished. And this was where Emily was born on the 30th of July, 1818. She was not the youngest child, she was not the eldest, she was the 5th child and the 4th daughter. You may remember there were 2 elder daughters than the well-known Brontes who died in their youth. It was in 1820, early in 1820, the whole family were translated across to Haworth, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. And this is what the old parsonage there looked like before it had the later 19th century additional side piece added. And this is where Emily grew up and where she spent much of her life. We all know that Emily wrote, early in her life, she wrote what we might call juvenilia, or juvenile works, and so did her sisters and her brother. They put together poems and other writings, often in very miniature sort of books. And in particular, Emily and her sister Anne invented a little world which they shared between them, which was called Gondel. Emily then, 1835, she went to Rowhead School, Murfield, 1838 to 39, Law Hill School, Southowram. This was her profession. She'd been taught mostly at home by her father and mostly by local people in Haworth before this time, and I shall be returning to the Law Hill section in a few moments. The only occasion when Emily and her sister Charlotte were outside the United Kingdom was when they went over to Brussels to study French and German in 1842 at the Pensionnat Ager. Only 2 copies were sold. Think about that. Emily and her, who were these people? Men named Bell, publishing poetry. Wasn't very popular. Only 2 copies sold in 1846. Poems, you can see, Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. Nobody knew who they were, nobody cared very much. You'd think that was a bit of a failure, but they do say if you start small, you can grow, don't they? And certainly Emily and her sisters did. You will remember, of course, that all 3 of the sisters wrote their own novel. Several of them wrote more than one, Emily just the one. And we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte, of course, Agnes Grey by Anne, and Wuthering Heights, which is more of our focus tonight. Right, sorry, I've gone too far there. There we are. We all know that Emily loved Haworth and the moors, but very probably she enjoyed exploring other moorlands not far away from where she was living and working at various times. As you probably know, Emily suffered from consumption quite early in her life. This is the tuberculosis bacillus, and this caused the deaths of all the young Brontë sisters before they were any great age, or influenced it, we believe. And by 1848, not that long after Wuthering Heights was published, under the name of Mr. Bell, it was clear to her friends that she was beginning to fade away. And Branwell, her brother, more about him another time, very talented man who perhaps got rather overlooked and of course got overcome by alcohol and other things. He died in September 1848, having been through various vicissitudes, and just shortly afterwards Emily herself passed away, not long before Christmas in 1848. That's the parish entry there, and it reminds us, of course, that Emily was in fact Emily Jane Brontë. She was the only one of the Brontë family to have a second forename. And here we also have the gate through which all the coffins went from the garden of the parsonage, and the modern inscription showing where some of them were buried in the church, actually in the earlier church than we have today. So Emily's godfather, I shall run through this quite quickly, but it's an interesting little link, and as his tombstone is now up at the parsonage at Haworth, it's worth mentioning. So Reverend John Fennell, he was a man from the south of England, and he was Emily's great-uncle by marriage, and he was given the duty of being her godfather in 1818. The following year, he'd been in Bradford, he was given the curacy of a church up at Crossstone. Some of you may have seen this. It's on the high road as you come out of Todmorden, turn up the hillside in the direction of Halifax, high up there. Building's still there. The first time that Reverend Fennell arrived there, it was an earlier chapel. It was rebuilt there in his time. And here again we see it, and this is the burial entry of Jane Fennell, who was the wife of the Reverend John Fennell. So this was the connection with the Brontë family. The Branwell family, different generations, great uncle, great niece, and so on. The funeral of Jane Fennell, which took place up at Crossstone in 1829, was taken by Archdeacon Musgrave, the Vicar of Halifax, whose monument you can see in the Minster today. The second marriage of Emily's great-uncle was to a lady called Elizabeth Lister. Now, I'm not going to go down that road tonight. You know, I talk about Anne Lister sometimes. I can't link this Lister with the other Listers, but Emily's godfather did marry a Lister, Elizabeth, and they were married at Halifax Parish Church in 1830. And they went on having children, which is quite strange really, because actually when the youngest children were born, I think the father was something like in his 70s or even beyond. So Vicar Musgrave of Halifax in 1841, he trotted up the Calder Valley and he baptised various children of John and Elizabeth. Then later that same year, he travelled up the Calder Valley again to take the funeral of his distant relative, the Reverend John Fennell, who's commemorated there. And as you'll see, he was 80 years old, and his youngest child, I think, was born that year or the year before. This is a transcript, as the original can't be photographed very well, of the tombstone. When the church up at Crossstone was closed in the late 1980s, one or two artefacts were taken from that church and brought to other places, and one of these, because of its interest and its connections with the Brontë family through the Fennells and through the I'll get it in a moment, the Branwells, that was in fact the inscription. We don't need to go into the detail, but the tombstone is now located at the parsonage. So we got through that section, and we'll move on to perhaps more interesting facts. Emily at Law Hill School. Many of you will know that Emily taught at Law Hill School, a building in Southowram, high up, really not quite on a plateau, it's almost like an edge, almost like a watershed between Bank Top and Southowram itself. on a bend in the road is this structure, which was originally a woolen warehouse. More about that in due course. Emily's employer was a lady called Miss Patchett. She was a local woman to Calderdale. She was baptised actually as Betty Patchett at St Mary's Chapel in Ludenden back in December 1789. Always known as Elizabeth, and she was to be Emily's employer. When Miss Patchett's sister Maria was to die, that caused a vacancy for a senior teacher at Law Hill School. The two sisters had founded this school together, so when one of them left, they needed someone to replace her. So it was when Maria Patchett, yes that's right, got married to a chap with the wonderful name of Titus Senior Brooke at Halifax Parish Church in September 1837, the vacancy occurred. Schoolmistress needed. We don't know exactly how Emily got to hear about this job, but we do know that writing in October 1838, Charlotte Brontë mentions her sister Emily's recent arrival at Law Hill, so it was a little after Maria Patchett got married. And we move on then and have a look at a lovely old sketch. Some of you will know of the sketches of Arthur Comfort, the local artist in the early 20th century Halifax, and he painted and sketched a lot of these old buildings, both in the town of Halifax and in other parts of Calderdale and even elsewhere. That's the house itself, the old woolen warehouse to the left. In the early 20th century, a lady called Mrs. Chadwick, who had the interesting name Mrs. Ellis H. Chadwick, which sounds a little bit of a mouthful to me, she did a lot of research into the Brontë family, which had not really been carried out before. She went out of her way to engage with a number of people, particularly women, who had known the Brontes in their youth. So they were getting quite elderly by the time she was doing her research, shortly before the First World War. We have to remember that Emily and Charlotte went back in the 1840s and 1850s, so you had to be a certain age to remember them. And she also would interview a number of the students of Miss Patchett, or those who had been. And as a result, various new facts came to light. Miss Patchett, we know from various accounts, enjoyed riding. She was an excellent horsewoman, and we might liken that to the elderly Cathy in Wuthering Heights. The little we know about Emily's time at Law Hill School, which was a school for girls, mostly older girls, but some younger girls, she seems to have been somewhat unhappy there. But it does sound as if her tasks were almost never ending. She didn't have much time off except perhaps on a Sunday, maybe occasional evenings off, and it was hard work. So she was drilled into teaching these girls. The Law Hill School party, as was typical in those days, would be taken to the local church. They'd be taken on a Sunday for worship, a whole gaggle of them, a whole group of them, and they were taken to St Anne's Church at Southowram, which was completed in 1819, I believe, so it was still quite a young church at that time. And this is where Emily presumably would have worshipped on the Sundays when she was working with the Miss Patchetts at Law Hill. We do know from information that Mrs. Chadwick picked up in the early 20th century that Miss Patchett, in her days as a schoolmistress, was in the habit of taking her pupils to see the museum in Halifax. And this building, which some of you might recall having seen in Harrison Road, was once the Halifax Literary and Philosophical Society's office plus museum, and they had a small lecture room to begin with. That society was founded in 1830. The building went up in 1834, so it was still very new in 1838-39. So, seeing we know that Miss Patchett took her girls there to have a look round, it seems a reasonable assumption that Emily could have gone along with them. Can't prove it, seems reasonable. So here, some other pictures of Laurel Hill House. This is the house